It's a beautiful day. Erickson's is open. You could be gardening, but you're here, so thank you for that. So first of all, this is our 10th Maynard Book Festival. We started in 2012, had a little hiatus, and we're back. We're back strong. So first, I want to thank the Friends of the Maynard Library and the Maynard Cultural Council for their financial support of the festival. We couldn't do it without them. Also, I want to thank Silver Unicorn for being here to sell books. It's always so much more fun when you can get a fresh copy of a book and get it signed by the author. It just makes the day. And I want to thank members of the festival committee. There are a number of you here today, and everyone who shared their hard work and talents, whether baking or organizing or whatever they did. And I wanted to make sure everyone noticed the art exhibit. Cindy Kennelly was here on Thursday to talk about the work. It's been just a joy to have her art about stories here with us today, and we'll be seeing more from Cindy soon. So she appeared just at the right time to be here for the festival. So that was just a little bit of serendipity. We have 2 more programs in the festival. Today at 3:00, we're having a panel of historical fiction authors. It's 3 excellent writers, so I think you'll enjoy that. And if you can come back at 7, Jenna Blom will be here. She is hilarious. And I loved one of the blurbs. Is it possible that a book about a serial killer could be this funny? We're also having mocktails tonight, so that's just a little bit of added fun. Please help yourself to refreshments, and we'll keep them coming as much as you eat. We'll keep them coming. So we hope you can come back or stay. If you're staying in town, ask anyone with a volunteer tag if you need a restaurant recommendation. And our friends at Six Bridges and Art Space are both having art openings today. One's 4 to 6, one's 5 to 7, so you could fit that in with your dinner plans. And we have 2 programs coming up after the festival that you might be interested in. On May 2nd, Maynard resident Andy Mickiewicz is talking about Maynard's service in World War II. So I think that's going to be really, really interesting. And then on April 14th, which is, God, is that next week? It's next week. 10 steps in researching the history of your house. So that's also going to be fascinating. You have to register for both of those. We're celebrating the United States 250th anniversary. And this is also the library's 20th anniversary in this building. So we'll be having a party this summer for that. Okay, I think that's me talking enough. Let's get started. We're delighted to have Doug Most with us today. He was here at a festival a number of years ago. Did we decide which one?
It would have been 2015, probably.
2015. So that was probably the 3rd one.
Yeah.
And he talked about his book, The Race Underground, which I still think about that talk. It was such a good talk. Cheryl mentioned she's here just because she came to that talk and she wanted to hear you again. So Doug Most is a veteran journalist in Massachusetts, author of 3 books, and now the executive editor and assistant vice president at Boston University. He's worked at newspapers in Washington, D.C., South Carolina, and New Jersey. He's spent 15 years as a magazine and features editor at the Boston Globe and has written for national magazines, including Sports Illustrated, Parents Magazine, and Runner's World. His latest book is Launching Liberty, the epic race to build the ships that took America to war. And I really like this quote from Keith O'Brien. In Launching Liberty, Doug Most reminds us of who we used to be and who we can still be again. This is a stunning story of American grit and ingenuity against all odds. And I think blurbs don't get much better than that. So help me welcome Doug Most.
So, thanks, Sally. So, it's fun to be back here. As Sally mentioned, I remember coming here with calling Ed and parking. Now I remember being here for the Race Underground book, which was a lot of fun. I'm much more of a local story about subways in America, the Boston subway, and this is a different book. This book is local everywhere, right? World War II has no home base, anywhere in the country is touched by World War II. So it's a different book, a different story, and a different time period. So what I'd like to do to sort of set this up before I start talking. I'm going to show you about a 1.5 minute video. And I like to show this video at the beginning because I think what it does is it helps just set the scene for sort of what was happening in the country at this time. And so this video, like I said, it's just 1.5 minutes. Just watch this and then I'm going to dive in.
In the early days of World War II, before Pearl Harbor pulled America into the fighting, our nation's fleet of cargo ships was tired, most of them relics from the First World War. Great Britain desperately needed more ships and asked America for help. The two nations struck a deal to build 60 British ships. It inspired President Roosevelt to launch his own emergency shipbuilding program, and with the help of the industrialist Henry J. Kaiser, they would build the Liberty Fleet.
This is a memorable day in the history of American shipbuilding.
These welded steel Liberty ships stretched 441 feet, longer than a football field, but the first ones took half a year to build, far too long.
This whole nation is becoming one great fighting force.
Hundreds of thousands of men and women had to be trained in shipbuilding. And women became the most important shipbuilders. They became known as Wendy the Welder.
We must build more cargo ships, still more cargo ships, until we achieve a launching each day.
The Liberty ship became the symbol of what Americans were capable of when their freedom and democracy were at stake. The fastest Liberty ship was built in 4 days and 15 hours. In 3 years, America built 2,710 Liberty ships. The war would have been lost without them.
Okay, so just sets the scene briefly. Now I'll go back. How'd I do? Okay. So what I'd like to do to start is I want to tell you two stories. And these stories are not from World War II, they're from just a couple of years ago. But they give you a little insight into the research that went into this story. So I started, people ask me how long did it take you to write this book? And the answer was about 5 years. That's sort of from start to finish. I started it during COVID. So like a lot of us, I was stuck inside, stuck in my basement, working on the book, working on research. And it was a solitary time. As I spent about 2 years sort of studying and researching Liberty ships, everything I had done up until that point was very two-dimensional. I saw drawings and schematics and blueprints, and I read books and articles and everything. I had so much material on Liberty ships, but it was a very two-dimensional experience for me. There are 2 floating Liberty ships left in this country. One is in San Francisco Harbor, called the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, and that ship has sort of been preserved as really almost in its original state, like a Liberty ship was back then. And the other Liberty ship that's still floating is in Baltimore. That's called the SS Joplin Brown. So there's 2 of them. I actually just learned, literally just a couple of days ago, there is a third in Greece, which I did not know about. Someone told me that I was at an event at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy down in New York, and someone said there's a third one in Greece. So you can see, even I'm still learning things about the Liberty ships. This Liberty ship in Baltimore was obviously close for me. I got in touch with a guy who was sort of the caretaker of that ship and reached out to him and said I wanted to come down to him on a book, and he offered to give me a private tour. So in the summer of 2023, I had to drop my son off at a golf camp in New Jersey, and I just kept on driving down to Baltimore. And I have a pretty vivid memory of the day. What I remember is driving down this gravelly road, parking my car, getting out, turning around. There was the Liberty ship right there. I could reach out and touch it. The thing that I was struck by as I walked sort of the length of the Liberty ship on the ground, I wasn't struck by how long it was, 441 feet. So as I said in the video, it's about 100 feet longer than a football field. But what I was really struck by was the height and the sort of the depth of the ship. It's about the height of a 10-story building. So they're tall ships. And as you can see here, these numbers that are on the hull there, 1 through 30, those sort of signified how deep into the water the ship would sink when it was loaded with cargo. So the Liberty ship that I saw, the John W. Brown, most of the hull was really exposed because it wasn't loaded with cargo. It was an empty ship. So I think the water went up to about number 11. But when these ships were loaded and fully loaded with millions of tons of cargo, that number 30 at the top would disappear under the water. So you can imagine just how deep into the water these ships were sinking, and that's why they had to be so deep. So I went I walked the gangplank up onto the ship, and I was greeted by Dick Stern, who sort of took me up into the deck house of the ship, and that's where the ship was steered from, and where the galleys were, where the kitchen was, where they slept, where the crew slept. Liberty ship only carried a crew of about 40 or 50 men, not a big crew. It was not a troop carrier. That was never its purpose. It was intended for cargo. And so we spent some time up in the deck house, and then I went into the engine room and saw the engine room and the boiler and all those things. But really what I wanted to do was go down in the ship and go down to the bottom. So he took me down this winding metal staircase and to the bottom, to the floor of the ship essentially, and into what was one of the 5 cargo holds. I'm going to show you a diagram of the ship just so you can sort of see what I'm talking about. I'm going to come back to these pictures. Here we go. Okay. So this shows sort of a diagram of a Liberty ship. And I was just talking with someone beforehand. This diagram is in the book. This illustration's in the book. It was done by a local illustrator named Joe McKendry, who has some ties, local ties to this town as well. Joe's a good friend of mine, a very talented illustrator, and he was kind enough to do this illustration for me in the book. So what you see here are the 5 cargo holds in the ship, and those really were the reason the Liberty ships were built. So when I went down into the floor of the SS John W. Brown, we walked into cargo hold number 2. And I remember sort of a very sort of moving moment. I walked into this cargo hold and it was empty, so it was an empty cargo. And I looked up, and it was so big, and the ceiling of roof was so far away and so tall. I felt like I was sort of in this cavernous sort of empty warehouse in a way. I allowed myself in that moment to sort of close my eyes because I had seen videos and I'd seen pictures. I'd seen a lot of things about Liberty ships at this point. But now here I was standing inside the bowels of a Liberty ship. And as I stood there, I closed my eyes and sort of I pictured a Sherman tank being lowered into this cargo hold, or a boxed up Jeep being loaded down into this cargo, or even a boxed up airplane being loaded into this cargo hold. So I'm going to give you some numbers to put the Liberty fleet and Liberty ship in perspective. One Liberty ship, a single Liberty ship, could hold 440 tanks.
What more?
Yeah, one ship could hold 440 tanks. Or another number, one Liberty ship could hold 2,800 Jeeps. Or another number, one Liberty ship could hold enough rations to feed 3 million men for a day. Oh, check on mics. Got it. It's good to know that I project.
Yes, that's something.
Sure. One Liberty ship was the equivalent of a 2-mile-long boxcar train. So we've all been stuck in a crossing where there's a long boxcar train coming. A 2-mile-long boxcar train would be the equivalent of one Liberty ship. So now imagine a fleet of almost 3,000 of these ships, and you get an idea of how much cargo they were capable of carrying for us. So standing in that cargo hold for the first time, now what was 2-dimensional for me suddenly became 3-dimensional. Now I was seeing it, picturing it, able to sort of really think about it in those terms. And it was really important for me. And I realized in that moment when I was standing there that in a lot of ways this is where the war was won. Nothing will ever take away from what our soldiers and troops did in the war, right? That will never be diminished. But remember that this war was fought across 2 gigantic oceans. The troops fought the war for us. They don't win that war without everything that was brought to them on board these ships. The tanks, the jeeps, the medical supplies, the ambulances, the planes, the ammunition, the food, all those things. They had to be brought to our troops in Europe, in North Africa, in Russia, all the places where the war was fought. they had to get supplies to them. And that's where the Liberty Fleet came into having its purpose. So that's sort of the first story that I wanted to tell you, just the idea of sort of experiencing a Liberty ship. It's not a tourist attraction in Baltimore. If you go down there, you are welcome to visit it. It's not something that's on the top 10 things to see in Baltimore, but it is a fascinating sort of experience to be on board one of these ships. Okay, so the second story I want to tell you is about the men and women who built these ships. So when I was researching the Liberty ships, I had a process in which I was sort of trying to find who were these people. And there are stories out there you can find about the men and women who built these ships. But if you do the math, like I did in 2020, 2021, it was not in my favor. So let's just work this out for a minute. If someone was, say, 20 years old when they started working on a Liberty ship in 1940, just to use round numbers, that means in 1940, they were 20 years old. That means they were born in 1920. That means in 2020, when I started my research, I'm looking for people who are 100 years old. So I'm looking for a little bit of a needle in a haystack. It's going to be hard to find these people. And even if I do find them, finding someone who's 100 years old, who's really able to sit down and have great memories and talk to me, that's going to be hard. I understood that. So I had a process where I would occasionally stumble into an article, a newspaper article about someone who had sort of helped build a Liberty ship at one of the ports across the country. And very often what I would do is I would look in an obituary database to see if I could find if they were still alive. And sadly, very often I would come across their obituary. That was just the way it was. But in 2023, I was working in my basement one night. I still remember this. I read an article up in Maine. The article up in Maine was about a husband and wife who had both worked in the Portland, Maine shipyard. And they'd worked on building Liberty ships in the Portland, Maine shipyard. Portland, Maine was one of the most active shipyards in the country at the time, building Liberty ships. And the story was about them celebrating their birthday. I read the article, and then I did a little poking around, and I couldn't seem to find obituaries. So I started to get my hopes up a little bit. I tracked down an email address for the daughter of the man who was mentioned in the story, and I sent her an email. And I told her what I was doing. I was working on a book about Liberty ships, and I had read the story in Maine and wondered if her parents were around. And she wrote me back the next day. And she said, sadly, that her mother had passed away about 6 months ago. The story was about 2 years old. Her mother had passed away about 6 months ago. But her father was still here, sharp as a tack, and would be more than thrilled to talk to me about his experience. I remember thinking to myself, can I come up tonight? We emailed for about a week or so. He actually got sick briefly, and I got a little nervous, but he recovered. It's fine. And I drove up to Portland, Maine, 2-hour drive. Donna Soma was her name. She met me and took me to her house. And Arthur Babineau came downstairs. And as a journalist and as a researcher, I'm trained to sort of go into these situations armed with a lot of questions. And I had a lot of questions for Arthur. Many, many questions written down and prepared to ask. And I think I asked like 3 of them. And that's because I literally just sat down at the kitchen table with Arthur and just listened. And sometimes that's the best thing a journalist and an author, a writer can do, is just listen, stop talking and let them talk. And Arthur was a great talker. He had great stories to tell. He was a little hard of hearing, but he was sharp as a tack, and told me stories about how he got the job, how he learned about the job. It paid him $35 a week. He was 18 years old at the time. He would take a bus down from his home further north and every day work at the shipyard. His job at the shipyard was to inspect the welds on the ships. That was his job. And he oversaw a group of about 20 men, and they sort of were the welders, and he oversaw them. And he told me one story about a ship that had passed inspection. It was ready to sail, and then he discovered a faulty weld in the ship and had to be opened up and repaired. He wondered what would have happened if I hadn't discovered that. He told me the story about meeting his wife in the shipyard. They were married for only 80 years. He told me a lot of stories. Arthur was great. It was a very sort of moving experience for me to talk with this 102-year-old guy who had these tremendous stories. I was grateful to his wife, to his daughter, Donna, for letting me come up and share his story. And I included Arthur's story in the book. In a 400-page book, he's like one page, but it was really important for me to just slip him in there because it was just important for his legacy and for that experience we had, and to share a little bit of his story. And Donna was kind enough to email me. So Arthur did pass away about 8 months later. And she emailed me a couple of days before he died. She was in the hospital with him, or in the hospice with him, I forget. And she said that he recalled the conversation we had. And he was sort of glad that he got to share his story. He didn't remember my name, but he remembered I talked to a reporter or someone who was writing about the Liberty ships, and I really was glad that I got to tell that story. There was something that was important to him. And Donna shared that with me. I was touched. So anyway, so those are two stories I like to tell because they're about, the importance of the Liberty ships and then the men and women who built them. So now let's back up for a minute. The Liberty ship itself was not an American designed ship. So it was designed by that fellow on the left. His name was Robert Cyril Thompson, who's a British shipbuilder. And early in the war, so you have to remember, the war was going on in 1939, 1940. America is not involved in the war. We are watching it from a distance, and the American attitude is we do not want to get involved in this war. This is not our war. This is not our fight. This is Germany. This is Great Britain. Not for us. And all the polling that was done at the time was really sort of very strong against American involvement in the war. President Roosevelt was a wise man, and he knew, like it or not, this war is coming. It's going to come to our shores. It's going to visit us one way or the other. He knew that. And he was trying to rally Americans to the idea that we can't pretend that this war is not going to impact us. He knew that it was going to eventually. What happened was in the summer or fall of 1940, Great Britain needed to build more cargo ships to help fight the war against Germany. All of their shipyards were at capacity. They couldn't build any more ships. They were being used for military ships, for naval ships. They couldn't build them in Great Britain. So they invited Robert Cyril Thompson to come down. He had designed this ship. He built this ship, and they liked this cargo ship he had built. And they said, we need you to go to the United States and to see if they would help us build these ships. They're our closest ally. They should want to help us defeat Germany. It was in America's best interest, of course. So Robert Thompson gets on a boat, comes across the United States. He's given essentially an allotment of money or budget. He's told this is how much you can spend on behalf of the British government, the British Admiralty, in order to get these ships built. And he was basically tasked with getting 60 ships built, 60 British cargo ships. That was the goal. He comes over to the United States and he meets with the head of the United States Maritime Commission. It's all by the name of Emery Scott Land. Goes by Jerry Land. And Jerry Land meets with Robert Thompson, essentially tells him, we are happy to help you. We want to help you, of course, but we're in the same predicament your country's in. You can't take our shipyards. Our shipyards are all being used to build naval vessels, military vessels, and those kind of things. So we're not going to give up one of our shipyards to help Britain build cargo ships. We just can't do that. But you are welcome to go around the country. Go around the country, meet with shipbuilders, meet with business owners, meet with anyone who might have land to build you a shipyard or maybe open a dormant shipyard. Do whatever you can. We will happily help you do that. And good luck to you. So Robert Thompson charters a plane, and for 3 weeks he flies around the country. That's what he does. He flies around the country, and he meets with shipyard owners and businessmen, all these different people who have shipyards, existing shipyards, or maybe they own dormant shipyards that are not being used. He meets with a bunch of people, and he goes all over. He meets San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, Houston, North Carolina, Tampa, all over. It was a meeting he had in Seattle that struck him, that stuck with him. He met with a guy in Seattle who was not a shipbuilder in the traditional sense, was not from the shipbuilding industry, was not an engineer, didn't seem to know the lingo of shipbuilding like he wanted. He was talking to Robert Thompson, who was a shipbuilder. He knows the lingo. That's what he does. And this guy he barely knew a stern from a bow and barely could talk shipbuilding. But he seemed to have this arrogance about him, this cockiness. And he said to Robert Thompson, I'll build you 200 ships. And Thompson was like, well, I only need 60. And he's like, I'll build you 200 ships. I can get it done. And so Thompson sort of had that meeting and walked away from it sort of a little puzzled, but impressed and at the same time a little confused. Goes back to Washington to meet with Emery Scotland, tells him about all the different meetings he had. And he says, there was this one fellow I met in Seattle, cheap, bald, roly-poly guy, and he told me he could build me 200 ships, and so I didn't really know a lot about him. And Land says, okay, so you met with Henry Kaiser. So he says, it's interesting you met with him. So Henry Kaiser, Land explained, actually does have a contract with the Navy to build 5 ships. He's building 5 ships right now for the Navy. The first 5 ships he's ever built. Never built a ship before. But we had gone out to inspect the contract. It was actually going very well. The work was ahead of schedule, under budget. We were sort of very impressed with it. And he says to Thompson, he might be a good partner for you on this project. Okay, so now Thompson at this point doesn't really have a lot of options. He goes back to California and meets with Henry Kaiser. Kaiser takes him out to a mud flat, a vast vacant mud flat in Richmond, California, across the bay from San Francisco. And he essentially waves his hands and says, here is your shipyard. And Robert Thompson's like, where is my shipyard? And he says, I'm going to build you a shipyard here. I'm going to build you a shipyard here, and we're going to build your ships right here. So Thompson at this point is like exasperated. He's sort of like, I don't have a lot of options on the table, but I have a contract to come here to the United States, get 60 ships built for our country. He goes back to Washington. They strike sort of a tentative deal, and the arrangement that the Maritime Commission is willing to strike is that they will build 30 ships on the West Coast, 30 on the East Coast. That was important for the United States. They did not want all 60 ships built in one place. They didn't want shipyards. They wanted the East Coast shipyards to get some of the business. That was important. So they struck a deal for there to be 30 and 30. At this point, Thompson begins to sort of send a cable back to the British Admiralty and tell them, here's the plan. But he realizes, they sent me over with this amount of money to just build ships. But now he's realizing, I'm not just building ships. First, I have to build shipyards. And then once I build the shipyards, then we have to hire workers to build those ships. The amount of money that the British Admiralty had given him was not going to cover a fraction of what he needed. So he decides he has to go back home and tell them in person what he needs. Gets on a boat to go back home. And on the way back across the Atlantic Ocean, his boat is torpedoed, sunk by the Germans. He is rescued along with a number of the men on the boat. Some people died. His lifeboat was rescued, and he was brought back to London. His wife had actually been listening to the radio and heard about the ship being torpedoed and wondered if her husband had been killed. She didn't know for sure until he got back home. He gets home, explains the deal to the British, and the British agree, this is what we're going to do. Those 60 ships that the United States built for the British are called the Ocean-class ships. And they become sort of the forebearer of what becomes the Liberty ship. 2 months after we strike that contract to build those ships, President Roosevelt goes before a group of media at the White House, and he says, we're going to start our own shipbuilding program. He's essentially inspired and realizes these cargo ships that the British are building, we need those too. We're going to build 200 American cargo ships based on the British design. That decision sort of launches the Liberty Ship program. Henry Kaiser in January of 1941, so again, we're not yet involved in the war. Henry Kaiser in January 1941 begins building his shipyard in Richmond, California, and by April, they've started laying the first keel for the Liberty. Very quickly got this program up and running. So who is Henry Kaiser? He plays really a pivotal role in my book and in the story of the Liberty Ship. So that's Kaiser there in the back with the glasses, with Roosevelt in the front. Henry Kaiser, born in 1882. And if I say the name Kaiser to you, I'm going to guess, tell me what comes to mind. What's the first thing you think? Oh, and was that?
Aluminum.
Aluminum. Interesting. I don't hear that. But that is true. Health. Someone say healthcare? Kaiser Permanente Healthcare. right?
Foundation.
Right? All of that. That's all Henry.
Kaiser.
What's that?
Deutsche Kaiser.
Yes.
German emperor. from
So
World War
different,
I
not
and
related,
before.
different Kaiser. Not related. So Henry Kaiser was born in this country, born in upstate New York in 1882. 3 months apart from when FDR was born in upstate New York in 1882. So they were born 3 months apart, barely 100 miles apart, same year, and they wouldn't cross paths for another 50 years. So Kaiser's born in 1882. Eventually he settles on the West Coast. He actually marries a girl that he met at the Dane School in Wellesley, Dane Academy in Wellesley, and they move out to the Pacific Northwest, where he becomes a contractor, starts building roads, bridges. He sort of is one of these guys who has this philosophy in business. He's not an engineer, not MBA, not a business guy, but he has this philosophy that if you hire the right workers, you give them the right tools, and you hire the right managers, they can do anything. They can build anything. It's all about the right people with the right management, the right tools. So he becomes a successful contractor in the Pacific Northwest. He's not a national figure, not known nationally by any means, just building roads and bridges out in Washington and California and other places. There's one funny story about sort of the beginning of him becoming a bigger player in California. He gets on a train to go to bid on a road project in Northern California. And he thinks he's on the right train with one of his most loyal employees who would stay with him for the next 40 years or so. And they think they're on the right train that's going to stop in this town. It turns out they're on the wrong train. The train is not going to be stopping in this town. And as the train, they make a decision that we're going to jump off of the moving train because we have to get this contract. This contract was going to be the biggest contract they'd ever had yet. And the train slowed down as it was coming through this town, and Henry Kaiser and his fellow worker jumped off the moving train and got that contract, and it does sort of become the beginning of his business. So in early 1930, the United States, early 1930, we are a country in the midst of a depression. The United States puts out for contract the biggest public works project in American history. Is what that was? What's that? Nope. Biggest public works project in American history. The Boulder Dam. Which becomes the Hoover Dam. The Boulder Dam. Huge project. Hydroelectric dam in the middle of the desert. Going to help power energy for hundreds of thousands of citizens. That project goes up for bid, and Henry Kaiser hears about it and decides he wants to bid to build it. Puts together a conglomerate of other sort of big contractors, and together their bid of $48 million wins the project. That project becomes very important to Henry Kaiser. They finish the dam project ahead of schedule and under budget. When it's open, President Roosevelt comes out. This is, again, an enormous project. Roosevelt comes out for the sort of unveiling and launching of the Boulder Dam, and he can't help but be impressed. Who did this project? How did they finish it ahead of schedule, under budget? How did they do this thing? Building a dam in the middle of the desert. That becomes the introduction for FDR and Kaiser, how they start to get to know each other. Over the years, Henry Kaiser became so popular in this country. He was actually rumored to be a vice presidential candidate for FDR when he ran for office. And the only reason he was not picked as a vice presidential candidate, interestingly enough, is that he'd given a speech years earlier. And when he was vetted, as they do, by the FBI as a candidate, they discovered he'd given a speech where he advocated for a sales tax. And back then, the idea of a sales tax was not a popular thing. And as soon as FDR, the FBI, they learned that he promoted and advocated a sales tax, he was crossed off the list. So he was never going to be a vice presidential candidate. But nonetheless, he was a very successful businessman. And as the 1930s went on, Americans get pulled into the war in 1941. The Liberty Program begins, and Henry Kaiser steps forward and offers his services to sort of start to build the Liberty fleet and these ships. So one thing about the first Liberty ships that were built, they took like 8 months to build. It's a really long time to build one ship. In 1941, we finished one boat, one ship. That's how long it took to build one ship. Kaiser knew, and everybody knew, that that needed to be sped up. That was not going to work. He needed to figure out a way to build these ships faster. So the shipyards were these sort of sprawling, vast. I have a picture of the Richmond shipyard. I'll show you. Here you go. So that's the Richmond shipyard. It's this sort of vast, sprawling, many, many acres of land. But one of the things that was happening is the way they started building the Liberty ships was they would essentially build it right here in the shipway. That's where they would build the ships. So they would lay the keel of the ship, build the hull of the ship, then lay the deck of the ship, then build the deck house on top of the ship. That was the process at the very beginning for how they built these ships. The problem, of course, is that, if you're the people, let's say the people who are building the deck house, well, they can't even start work on the deck house until the keel is laid, the hull is built, the deck is laid, then the deck house comes. So there needed to be a different way to build these ships. There was a very famous, different Henry of the day, Henry Ford. Henry Kaiser sent an employee up to Detroit because he was fascinated with the fact that somehow Henry Ford was able to pump out 40,000 vehicles a month. How is he doing that? How is Henry Ford cranking out 40,000 vehicles a month? So he sent an employee up there to sort of study what Henry Ford was doing and what the Detroit plants were doing. And the answer was the assembly line manufacturing process, which is what Henry Ford had perfected. The idea of the assembly line, where a vehicle would roll down to the workers. Instead of having the workers go to the vehicle, bring the vehicle to the workers. That was a big deal. And what it allowed is a team of workers were stationed in one place, and the vehicle would come down, and their job was very simple. Do whatever your job is. Attach the doors, build the chassis, whatever your job is, that's it. And of course, the more you do any job, the better you get at it, the faster you get at it, right? If you're just doing it over and over and repetitive, you're going to get better at it. So this worker comes back and tells Henry Kaiser, this is how they're working it up in Detroit. And the idea becomes, okay, how do we transfer this assembly line manufacturing process to building ships? It's one thing to roll a 15-foot Model T down an assembly line. You can't roll a 440-foot ship down an assembly line. That doesn't work. But maybe there's a way we can build these ships in stations, in different places, and then bring those parts together. So the analogy I like to use, we've all perhaps gifted a child a box of Legos. So when you open up a box of Legos, in there you're going to see maybe 3 or 4 bags of components of that toy that they're going to build. If you dumped all those bags into one gigantic pile and then started to build it, that's going to take you a while to figure out where everything goes. But what if you gave one of those bags to a group of boys or a group of kids, another bag to a different group of kids, and a third bag to a different group of kids, and you told them, you build that, and you build that. And now bring those parts together, and we're just going to snap them all together. That would get built much quicker than the other way. And that's sort of what they started to do with Liberty ships. They would prefabricate, that was the term, prefabricate different components of the ship in different places. So for example, let's take the deck house. The deck house was essentially a 3-story building on top of the ship. They would build the deck houses like a mile away in a different part of the shipyard. That was the only thing those workers were doing, just building deck houses. So they could wheel those deck houses out with giant cranes, bring them out, and then they would just lift up those maybe 3 or 4 parts, plop it on top of the ship, attach it, and you're done. And so if that's all they were doing, those deck houses could be built quickly, more and more. You could build 10 or 20 deck houses at a time. So that's sort of how they started to build the Liberty ships faster. The process went from 8 months to 6 months to 3 months. Eventually got it down to like the average time to build one Liberty ship was 1 month. It's pretty remarkable to build one ship in a month for an average time. One of the things about Kaiser that he sometimes gets criticized for is he was sort of, some people think he had too much credit. He was a marketing genius. He was a marketer who sort of liked to take credit for things. And there is some truth to that. But he also was sort of a brilliant businessman. And Kaiser recognized, American involvement in the war was not popular. Even though we were defending ourselves now and it was something that everyone recognized we had to do, it was still a tough fight for Americans to be excited about this war. Kaiser knew that Americans were in particular not very excited about Liberty ships. He was impressed with what was happening. Hundreds of thousands of workers had come from around the country to the shipyards that were building Liberty ships. They had sort of lifted up their lives and given up everything, moved their families to these different towns. The town of Richmond, California, which originally had 24,000 people, in 1942 had 100,000 people living in it. So it just swelled with people from all the workers who came from around the country to build these ships. So Kaiser knew that this was a remarkable thing that was happening with all these ships being built around the country, but Americans weren't paying attention. It was just not something that was on their radar. How could he change that? How could he get people excited about a Liberty ship, a 440-foot steel cargo ship, not the sexiest thing in the world? He decided one way to do it would be with a race, like the Olympics. What if we did a competition? What if we said to two shipyards, you're going to be in competition. Who can build the fastest Liberty ship? Ready, set, go. He actually put up a scoreboard in the two shipyards that he was going to have compete with each other to see who could do it better and faster. He owned 4 shipyards. One was in Portland, Oregon, and another was in Richmond, California, with 2 of them. The one in Portland, Oregon was run by his son, Edgar, and the one in Richmond, California by his most loyal employee, this fellow named Clay Bedford. He told those 2 men, your shipyards are in competition with each other to see who can build the fastest Liberty ship. This was in the summer and the fall of 1942. So roughly 6 to 8 months after Pearl Harbor and after he'd been pulled into the war. So in the early fall of 1942, the shipyard in Portland, Oregon built a ship in 26 days. That was at the time the fastest ship that had ever been built, the Liberty ship. Richmond, California responded about 3 weeks later and finished the ship in 24 days. So cut 2 days off. 3 weeks later, Portland responded and built a ship in 10 days. When they finished the ship in 10 days, they were so confident that the race is over. That's it. 10-day ship. President Roosevelt was invited across the country to be there for the launching of the ship. He came with his daughter, and they smashed the champagne bottle on the hull of the ship. Life magazine took pictures of it. It was a big deal. And the 10-day ship was launched. Edgar Kaiser, who launched that ship, invited Clay Bedford from Richmond to come and witness the launching of the ship because he wanted to rub his nose in this a little bit. You built the 24-day ship, we built the 10-day ship. Clay Bedford returned to Richmond, California, and told his workers about the 10-day ship. And they said, we're going to beat that. And he said what they did was they collected any idea. They spent a couple of weeks compiling ideas, almost like the biggest suggestion box you can imagine. How can we build the ship faster? And remember, these were stunt ships. I want to be clear about that. No one expected this to be the regular pace they were going to build ships. This was a marketing gimmick. It was a marketing stunt. So they compiled all these ideas. How can we cut 30 minutes here, an hour there, 3 hours here? What can we do to just trim a little time off of the production of a Liberty ship? On November 7th, 1942, workers lined up, thousands of workers lined up, and at midnight, the shipyard was bathed in bright white lights. And at midnight, a whistle blew. 1,000 workers burst into action, like a football play, sort of, someone says hike, and they all go. They burst into their roles, they started working. They worked around the clock in shifts, 8-hour shifts, nonstop. One group would come off, another group would walk in, they would just keep working, nonstop. And on November 12, 1942, the SS Robert E. Peary was launched in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes.
Wow.
It was a pretty remarkable feat to build one Liberty ship in 4 days, 15 hours. To be clear, it was a little cheating because it was prefabricated. It's not like they started from complete scratch. Some of the parts had already been built and they were waiting, so they were sort of ready to build it. But that's how they had all been built. So they were prefabricated, but they still put the ship together in 4 days and 15 hours. That ship launched, and Henry Kaiser was right, because the next day, newspapers across the country ran headlines. Kaiser Shipyard launched a ship in 4 days. No one could believe it. And so this marketing gimmick, this idea that he had, worked. People were now talking about Liberty ships and excited about them. And it also sort of galvanized the men and women who were building these ships. I didn't talk too much about the men and women, but the one thing I do want to mention, and then I'm going to open it up to questions, is the women. So we've all heard the term Rosie the Riveter. These ships were welded together. They were not riveted. And that was a big change for the shipyards and for the ships, welding them instead of riveting them. And by doing that, they had to teach people how to weld. Welding was a very specific skill. And what they discovered when they were teaching people how to weld was that women were actually better at it than men. Because welding required sort of a certain dexterity with the welding tools and the technology, sort of reaching to tight corners and tight spaces. And a woman's sort of skinnier arm and muscular arm was able to sort of get in there in a way that men could not. And so women became really critical to the welding. And they were nicknamed Wendy the Welder, which I sort of referred to as like a cousin of Rosie the Riveter, if you want to think of it that way. And there were competitions around the country, women to see who could be the fastest welder. Eleanor Roosevelt invited the winners to the White House, and they would meet, have lunch with the First Lady. So it really became a thing, this idea of sort of women, and the welding, and the competitions, and the role that they played in the war. This is just some of the propaganda you see. So thousands and thousands of workers from around the country were trained in building these Liberty ships. They gave up their lives to do it. In the book, I tell the story of one woman whose husband moved from Mississippi to Richmond, California, to join Henry Kaiser's shipyard there. And then 6 months later, she had 5 kids. She was pregnant with her 6th. She got on a train in Mississippi and rode the train from Mississippi through Texas up through Los Angeles and up to Richmond to meet her husband, join him there. And she went to work in the shipyard too. 6 kids, that's what she did. They picked up their lives, these men and women, really to help, partly out of patriotism, partly because they were good, steady paying jobs, and it was an opportunity to work, and they wanted to help. So it was a remarkable part of the story, the people who sort of did that to give up their lives. It was a great sort of piece of the Liberty Ship story. The last thing I'll mention, just in terms of the research, one of the things that was fun for the research angle of this story was a librarian, loved librarians, in Richmond, California, in the 1980s, had interviewed a bunch of the shipbuilders who worked in Richmond, California shipyard. She interviewed them, she recorded the interviews, she transcribed the interviews, and then she put them on file at the Richmond, California Library. Those became, for me, this sort of epic source of information. I could actually listen to shipbuilders tell the story about how they came to Richmond, why they settled there, what their work was like, the jobs that they did. Those interviews were incredible, and they were so helpful, and I was so grateful that this librarian, I still remember her name, Shirley K. Dunning. I still remember her name. She did this incredible sort of gift by interviewing these workers who played such an important pivotal role in the war and building these ships. The only other pictures I have here, and then I'll take some questions, real briefly. The fellow on the right there, his name is William Francis Gibbs. He was the preeminent American ship designer of the time. His job, which he hated, was to take Robert Thompson's blueprints and designs for the ship and to essentially Americanize them. Because remember, Thompson was British. Those ship designs and schematics and everything he did were for British workers, with British measurements, British tools, British workers. But they were going to be built in America. So Gibbs was tasked with taking that design, that blueprint, those measurements, and putting them readable and making them workable for American shipbuilders. He hated the job. He was a shipbuilder and ship designer himself. He was now taking someone else's work and just modifying it and tweaking it. He was grumpy about it. He did it for the money, and then he moved on. But it was an important role he played. That's Pete Newell, who ran the Portland, Maine shipyard, which we talked about. He was an MIT graduate and really ran the Portland operation up there, Bath, Maine, and Portland, Maine, the shipyards up there, and played a pivotal role in building the Liberty ships up in Portland. Talked about that. That's just some pictures that show what the construction was like of the ships. You can see the scaffolding and what it was like when the deck was going in and just how many workers were working on these ships. Crazy. That's showing the launching of a ship. That's the Peary that we talked about. It was a big day. And how am I getting on time? Okay. I'll stop there. So I feel like I was speed reading. I sped through a lot of the story. I skipped a lot. but that gives you just an overview of the Liberty Ship program. One of the questions I very often get is, why'd you write this book? Why this book? So what you discover pretty early on when you start researching World War II is that you're not the first one to write about World War II. As my office at home would attest, I have about 100 books on my bookshelf there. But when I started looking into the Liberty Ship's story, I really didn't find a great book about them. And I was sort of impressed with the story, and I felt like it was this underappreciated angle of the war. So many books are written about, battles in the Atlantic and the Pacific and the fighting and all of that. And this was about something else, about, the ships that brought all the materials. We've all heard the term the arsenal of democracy that FDR talked about. That arsenal of democracy that was built in this country had to be brought to our troops around the world. And that's what these ships were for, to bring that arsenal of democracy to our troops. So I thought it was this underappreciated story that maybe I could figure out a way to squeeze in another World War II book. And that's why I wrote the book. I will stop there. Questions, things I didn't get to talk about. Shoot.
Two questions. First of all, at least in recent years, the main shipyard that's known as Portland Main Shipyard is actually in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on the New Hampshire side of the Piscataqua River.
Yeah.
Was that the truth?
No, the main shipyard was in South Portland, Maine. That's where they, in South Portland, he had land there. He actually bought some land that he saw and he thought would be perfect for a shipyard. It was very different than the land in Richmond, California. As you can imagine, Richmond was this sort of vast mudflat. The coast of Portland, Maine is rocky, and it's a different kind of land. And they had to dredge, and they had to build it within the rocks. So it was sort of a much more complicated shipyard that had to be built. But it was built in South Portland, Maine.
Okay, second question. One of the dangers in shipbuilding historically has been from asbestos. Was that used in Liberty ships?
It was used, but back then, obviously the dangers of asbestos were not known and it was not a concern back then. But yes, there was asbestos used in some of the Liberty ships, yes.
Do you know how many crew members they would have had?
Yeah, so about 50. A typical ship had 40 to 50 men. About 40 of them were merchant marines, and 10 were usually Navy personnel to sort of help. One of the questions that comes up often is, were the ships armed, right? How did they sort of, manage the war? The answer is they were lightly armed. So they were not, no one ever thought they were going to take down, German ships when they were encountered. And they also were very slow. Liberty ships traveled like 11 knots on the ocean, which is very slow. There's a famous story that I talk about in the book, and again, I was at the Merchant Marine Academy. It's a big story up there. In the middle of the war, a Liberty ship called the SS Stephen Tompkins was encountered by a German raider, German ship. When Hitler's, German fighters would encounter a Liberty ship on the ocean, their eyes would light up because they knew this ship couldn't put up a fight. It just was not prepared to battle. And they also knew that it was loaded with valuable cargo. And so the idea of taking down a Liberty ship was always very, very appealing to Germans when they could torpedo a Liberty ship and sink it. It was great. It's why the importance of the Liberty ship program, Roosevelt would say, the goal is we have to build more ships than the Germans can sink. Build them faster than the Germans can sink them. So that every time one Liberty ship went down, there were 10 more coming behind it. It just didn't matter. It overwhelmed them. The Tompkins was encountered by this German raider, and those fights typically lasted 10 minutes, just over quick. The crew of the SS Stephen Tompkins put up a valiant fight. They manned all their machine guns that they had, and they would not go down. And what ended up happening, one of the merchant marines who was manning a machine gun, he was shot, killed, he fell off. Another merchant marine jumped in the seat, took over the machine gun, fired away, was very accurate in the shooting, and his name is Edwin O'Hara, and he's a hero at the Merchant Marine Academy today. Both ships went to the bottom of the Atlantic. The Liberty ship took down the German ship, and both ships were sunk. And it was this heroic sort of moment. It was a Liberty ship the idea of a Liberty ship taking down a German ship was sort of unfathomable. No one could imagine that. And that story sort of became lore in sort of, World War II history and Liberty ship history. A future Liberty ship was named the SS Paul Buck after the captain of the SS Stephen Tompkins. Should have taken that down. Yeah. Chief?
I made it too much of a question. Jeremiah Brown came to Portland in 2000.
Yeah.
Came to Portland and you could.
Did you? That's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Because I was fun, grew up and
Okay.
screwed up the wood.
Yep. That's great.
But one of the things I did was when we were far at sea on the screens, they had two, in this case, Japanese fighter planes attack the ship. So you got to stand, hold on to this machine gun as a plane came at you.
Wow.
To find, cut, 5-6 feet over your head.
Wow.
And you were basically unarmed.
Right.
Above with
Right.
it was almost nothing.
So that's crazy.
And it was really, even though you know the record,
Right. Still.
but they're coming straight at
Hard stopping. Yeah. That's pretty cool. Yeah. I mean, when I was on the John W. Brown, being in the deck house where you could sort of look out, the windows would, they all had boards that they could pull a string and just snap the boards to come down and block the windows so that you couldn't see inside. And it was just sort of like, it made you appreciate, what it must have been like in the war to really be out at sea and the tension that must have been felt on these ships, especially knowing that they really were essentially unarmed. They just couldn't do much. If they were attacked, the only goal of the guns that they had was to just hold off the sinking for 20 minutes to allow the crew to get off. That was the goal. Yeah.
Considering that these must have been wonderful targets for the U-boats, did they ever have records of how many were lost?
So as far as yes, the answer is yes. As far as I can tell, approximately 200 to 300 were sunk in the walls. So somewhere in that range. So a lot, but that's why they built so many of them, because they wanted to have, they knew they were going to go down. So approximately 200 to 300 were lost to U-boats in the war.
Was there any use for these ships after the war?
So, yeah, I get that question a lot. So, yes, one of the decisions that Roosevelt made was that we weren't going to build ships that were going to last a generation. These were ships meant for a specific purpose. They were not going to be the best ships, the fastest ships, the biggest ships. They were going to last for the war, and then whatever happens after that is gravy, essentially. So they were used after the war as cargo ships to, take things around the world. Many of them, starting in the 1960s, started to be scrapped for the steel, which is very valuable. And the steel was sort of reused, so a lot of them were scrapped and used for that. The most bizarre story was the SS John W. Brown, which actually was a New York City public school for about 20 years. Parked in New York City, it was used as a public school for about 20 years. That was a rarity, but so they were used for some different purposes. Yeah. Yeah.
Were the ships owned by the U.S. government or were they owned by private shipping firms?
No, they were owned by the U.S. government. They were government ships. They were owned by the U.S. Maritime Commission, and they were government ships. Yep.
Yeah, for years I worked in the museum business.
Yep.
I want to say 2010, I worked on the National Park Service. They put it out in Richmond. There.
Yeah.
So that, yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, it's cool. And they have a big Rosie the Riveter exhibit out there, and it's an important sort of institution. So yeah, it's a cool place. The other questions? Thanks for coming out. I really appreciate it. It's a nice day, and I appreciate your time.